It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. Well, a few weeks ago, I talked about Young Frankenstein. Well, this week, I'm going to talk about Lady Frankenstein. This is a 1971 Italian film, and there should be an asterisk next to that, because even though it is an Italian movie, it's actually made by an American, directed by Mel Wells, who was actually a character actor, and he was in quite a few of he did a handful, I should say, of Roger Corman and Roger Corman related features and stuff. He actually is probably best known as playing Mr. Mushnick in Corman's original Little Shop of Horrors. He then, mostly did some like overdub work. He actually overdubs one of the characters in this movie. But, he was mostly just an actor. Now, interestingly, this was released by New World Pictures. I don't know if this was his connection to Corman or what, but it is kind of interesting that even though this is through and through an Italian movie, it is actually directed by an American, and actually has a handful of Americans in the movie too. And it's kind of a who's who of people who made a lot of Italian movies in the 60s and 70s. First and foremost is Joseph Cotten. He plays Baron Frankenstein, and he did a lot of westerns in the later part of his career. However, in the earlier part of his career, he became really, really good friends with Orson Welles in the mid-30s. He actually worked with Welles doing radio plays. One of the radio plays ended up becoming the War of the Worlds broadcast, but he ended up being in two of Welles's most popular movies. He was in Citizen Kane, and then he followed that up with Welles in The Magnificent Ambersons. So, he actually had a really, really long career that spanned almost 40 years or a little over 40 years, I suppose, when acting. And then he did a lot of radio stuff in the 30s, too. So he was not an insignificant actor, and had a handful of leading roles, too. Also in this movie is Mickey Hargitay. He is the police captain in this movie. Of course, he was the husband of Jane Mansfield. He was I think he was a Mr. Universe contestant. And he is the father of Mariska Hargitay, who's on the Law and Order TV shows. So, of course, his name may be a little bit better recognized than some of the stuff that he'd actually done at the time. Also in this is Baron Frankenstein's assistant, Dr. Marshall, is played by Paul Mueller. He had a 50-plus year doing European and Italian cinema. So he would have been pretty recognizable in a ton of Italian flicks and stuff like that. But our lead in this is Rosalba Neri. Now, she's our titular Lady Frankenstein. She did a whole bunch of Euro spy movies because she is very attractive, and she's very alluring and kind of exotic in the way that you would have seen in a lot of the spy movies made in the 60s. And she also did a bunch of spaghetti westerns as well. But being the sexy lady that she was, she ended up doing a lot of erotic horror and erotic gialli in the late 60s and early 70s, working specifically with Jess Franco for a movie or two, and just so she was a bit of a bombshell, if you will, and that plays actually a really important part in this movie itself. So, what's this movie about? Well, We've got Lady Frankenstein. She's come home from school where she completed her studies in medicine. She is back home at Castle Frankenstein. The Baron is, of course, world-renowned surgeon. She's become a surgeon. She mentions that she would kind of like to start assisting her father in some of the transplant stuff that he does. He is still kind of going off the reputation of being an animal transplant surgeon, but she knows a little bit better and kind of knows that he's doing some human transplant, some human resurrection type of stuff, and that's really what she wants to get into. And sure enough, Baron Frankenstein is into some shady stuff because he oftentimes pays a trio of grave robbers who are not exactly the greatest of people in this town to kind of, dig up the bodies and get him the tools that are needed. But she watches him and his assistant, Dr. Marshall, working on a recently executed thief or bad guy, I guess, that the grave robbers have taken the body for. And, she's like, hey, let me help you out. There's some things that I know about that might really be able to help you. But he's not really having it. But sure enough, Dr. Frankenstein does succeed, and he resurrects the dead guy. However, there was brain damage to the creature, which makes him violent. And he one of the first things he does is kill Dr. Frankenstein and then escapes into the night. And Tanya, the Lady Frankenstein, doesn't really want the police involved because she is a little bit concerned about her father's reputation, partially because she wants to get involved with what he's done. So, she doesn't want Dr. Marshall to call the Mickey Hargitay police captain to start investigating. But if he does, which he does end up contacting the police because he convinces her, hey, if I do this, I'll just say a robber came in and did this. We'll take the time to try to figure out the monster situation later. The next day, the monster's kind of rampaging through through the fields, if you will, of this town. Comes across a couple that are just kind of out in the open having sex. He scares the guy off, and then picks up the girl who's fainted and throws her into the river, killing her. Well, while the creature kind of rampages and starts really kind of killing a lot of people around the town, of course, the town's starting to get a little nervous about this, right? So the police captain, he's investigating. He's getting a little bit too close for comfort. So what Lady Frankenstein decides to do, she's going to create another creature to destroy her father's creature. Dr. Marshall initially doesn't really want to help, but she kind of calls him out on something. Apparently, he quite likes Lady Frankenstein. For years, he seems to have stuck around helping her father out only because he could stay close to Tanya. And she basically says, hey, look, I'll marry you. You probably never thought I'd say that, but I'll marry you. And, just help me out with this thing. What took you and my father 3 years will only take me 3 weeks. So stick around. Oh, and by the way, I want the hunky dullard that does yard work for Dad to be the body that we use. So we got to kill him. Oh, and by the way, I'll marry you if I can put your brain in the hunky dullard's body. Cool, okay. Dr. Marshall eventually gives into that idea because, you know what? He's kind of an old guy. His brain works pretty good, and his brain sees that Tanya Frankenstein is not an insignificantly beautiful woman. So he's like, hey, you know what? I'm good for this. So she transplants. Well, she ends up seducing the dullard into in her quarters, which then allows for Dr. Marshall to suffocate him. They take him to the lab. They shave off all the hair on Dr. Marshall, and he's like, "Hey, yeah, you kind of got to go through with this because we just killed a guy, and I would just really rather we just kind of go through with this." So she transplants his brain, and it works perfectly. However, the monster has killed like 8 or 10 people in town, so there's a problem there, and they realize that the police guy is going to eventually find the monster, but Dr. Marshall is like, "Hey, you know what? He's going to come and find me. He'll come back here to finish what he started with killing the people who brought him back to life." So sure enough, that's what happens. You've got a monster who comes in. You have the Dullard's sister trying to find him. You got the cop knowing that Lady Frankenstein is clearly up to something no good. You've got the villagers in town who are, they've picked up pitchforks and torches. They're having enough of this shit. And everything basically comes down to, we got to get to Castle Frankenstein. Monster comes in. Monster and the Dr. Marshall monster fight. Between Lady Frankenstein and Dr. Marshall monster, they're able to kill the old monster. And meanwhile, the townsfolk have started burning down the Frankenstein joint. The lady realizes that the sister of the Dullard sees what she thinks is her brother having sex with Lady Frankenstein. She's a little put off by this. The police captain gets her out of there. Everything is burning down around them, but they're having the good time sex in the burning building. Dr. Marshall monster and Lady Frankenstein, and the movie ends very abruptly after he strangles Lady Frankenstein, and that's it. That's the end of the movie. I have a feeling that the incredibly abrupt ending has more to do with the very rough cut and very rough version of the movie that Amazon Prime has, more so than how the movie really ends. I would really love for someday for probably not Vinegar Syndrome, but probably Severin to come along, get this movie, clean it up, and give it a nice new release. And the reason why I would like for them to do that is going to now be discussed in my 3 likes that I have for this movie. First and foremost, this is actually a real decent attempt to make a cheaper version of a Hammer horror movie. It's really trying for the gothic feel and the gothic atmosphere of the Hammer Frankenstein movies. I mentioned a few weeks ago that Mel Brooks wasn't too excited about doing Young Frankenstein. Well, the main reason why was between from the late 50s through to the mid 70s, Frankenstein was a very easy property to make cheap movies out of. It was in the public domain as far as movies that you could make based on a book or based on concepts or whatever. There were tons of movies like this being made at this time, and a lot of cheap ones. This one, while not exactly as highly well made as a Hammer movie, doesn't look entirely cheap. It knows what it's going for. It is, it's got the castle layout. It's got a decent looking monster, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. And it's got a halfway decent plot. I will say that the movie is maybe not the best directed for the actors that are in the movie. Again, it's an Italian movie where you have some people who speak English, some people who speak Italian. There's German-speaking folks there. It's not exactly a great thing for a director who's not used to that sort of scenario. So there are some awkward performances in it. But for a movie that wants to do something kind of cheap, but do something that is at least in the style of the popular Frankenstein movies that were out at the time, it's actually going for it. It's really not a very badly made movie whatsoever. There's some weird cuts, there's some weird performances, but overall, it looks pretty good. Actually, it looks like a real movie. Which is more. You can say that more for this movie than you could some of the other B movies of the time that was just trying to cash in on a quick buck on a Frankenstein or Dracula movie. Number 2, I really, really like the fact that we have a female villain in this movie. This kind of comes down to Rosalba Neri being very alluring in this. That's kind of part of this whole narrative. In the Hammer movies, you always had you always had Peter Cushing kind of being this morally corrupt character, and he is outright a bad guy. He's insane. He's kind of a psychopath. In this, Neri kind of dials that back a little bit, and she's manipulative, and she's quite, you can tell that she really only cares about the scientific part of it and what she wants to do with it. She doesn't really care about it being something that proves a theory. She doesn't really want to be famous for it. She just wants to play God, and it actually kind of works pretty well in this. And then finally, there's a cool looking monster in this. It's not the best makeup, but I know what it's going for, and I kind of like what it does do. It's a little bit grosser, because when Baron Frankenstein puts him up on the roof to be struck by the lightning so that he can become so they can bring the creature back to life. His head catches on fire, so half of his face is like melted and goopy and everything. He also has a very enlarged head. It almost comes across like what you would have seen if Jason Voorhees had grown up. It's the same kind of bulbous head that you saw him as a kid in the first Friday the 13th movie. So it really, it kind of evokes that, and I wonder if Tom Savini had seen that movie and said, hey, I kind of like that bulbous head, melty face sort of thing, because he looks an awful lot like kid Jason Voorhees. And I wouldn't be terribly surprised if there is a little bit of inspiration that comes from that. But it's a cool monster. I mean, the monster doesn't do much. He just rampages through town. There are a couple of moments in the movie where he's just picking up a naked lady, because naked boobs are going to sell tickets to this movie. No problem. He's just, beating people over the head or whatever. He's not really doing a lot, but it's a cool looking monster nonetheless. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure, our regular podcast, which is every Wednesday. You get a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday, and both of those shows are on filmseizure.com. You can also find both of those shows where fine podcasts are found, like your SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and even through Audible. Additionally, you can hop on over to Facebook and Twitter to follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. And while you're at it, why don't you head over to bmovieenema.com. That's where you can read some of my reviews and whatnot each and every Friday morning. If you do want to watch a movie and not just read about it, I do have the episodic B Movie Enema, the series, that is on YouTube. New episodes have been released every week these first 3 months of the year, from January 2nd to March 27th. This Saturday is actually the season finale for season number 1. But season number 2 will pick up again in September. So come watch a full movie on YouTube. Just search YouTube for B Movie Enema, and then subscribe to the channel there, or you can check it out on bmovieenema.com as well. So check those things out, and until next week, stay spooky